It all seemed to be going so well for Russia as the Ukraine war entered December 2025. On the first day of that month, Russia made the grand announcement that it had been waiting to make after close to 2 years of fighting. Pokrovsk had finally fallen. That announcement came just ahead of a meeting that Vladimir Putin's and US President Donald Trump's envoys were about to hold in Moscow. It was all a little too convenient. While the Kremlin claimed victory to influence diplomatic envoys, Pokrovsk remains a killbox. Entrenched Ukrainian defenders leveraging 3D urban terrain are currently maintaining an unprecedented 15-to-1 infantry casualty ratio against Russian assault groups. The Pokrovsk front line is collapsing. Putin's claims have been exposed for the bald-faced lies that they always were. Not bad for a city that has supposedly fallen to Russia. The revelation of the Russia versus Ukraine casualty rate comes from a video of a conversation between Jason J. Smart and Chuck Farrar, which was published on the Kyiv Post's YouTube channel. The description of that video says that Russia now has confirmed losses of 15 soldiers to every 1 Ukrainian soldier. In the video, Farrar outlines the situation as it stands for Russia, saying, "Well, despite claiming almost every day that they have taken Pokrovsk, and despite the fact that the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians in the sector somewhere between 10 and 15-to-1, Pokrovsk has still not come under control of the Russians." Farrar has a point about the scale of the challenge that Ukraine has faced up to since Putin decided to ramp up the Pokrovsk assault during the summer of 2025. The capture of the city was one of Putin's main goals for his summer offensive. Of course, we now know that this capture didn't happen, and it still hasn't. But Russia keeps on pushing. By November, United 24 media was reporting that Russia had sent almost 170,000 soldiers to capture Pokrovsk. That's more than the entire armies of many European nations, the outlet points out. What's more, it gives us an indicator of how many soldiers Ukraine has defending Pokrovsk. If Farrar's assessment is accurate, there will likely be between 17,000 and 11,333 Ukrainian soldiers in Pokrovsk, which places a much bigger spotlight on Russia's abject failure to take the city. Yes, Pokrovsk is a fortress, but with such a massive numerical advantage, Russia should have toppled it by now. It's not just soldiers that Russia is deploying in Pokrovsk either. Farrar notes that Russia is pummeling what's left of the city using massive airstrikes and, when it's able, artillery barrages. 170,000 soldiers doesn't seem to be enough for Russia, but then neither does the damage being caused by these strikes, which should be wiping out the Ukrainian defenders. Instead, the opposite seems to be happening. But these are all coming to naught, Farrar says of Russia's air and artillery strikes. Of Russia's daily burn, which is somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 casualties, about 30 to 40% of those casualties occur right in the Pokrovsk area of operations. In other words, Russia is a long way away from the success that it has claimed in the Pokrovsk direction. It's absorbing massive casualties in return for very little, if any, progress. How massive those casualties are is a source of debate. On December 22nd, the New Voice of Ukraine reported on comments made by the commander of Ukraine's 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Air Assault Forces, Yevhen Lasachuk. He delivered some figures that are a little different from the ones we've shared so far. Lasachuk estimates that Russia has committed 150,000 soldiers to Pokrovsk rather than 170,000. Russia's forces had also lost 6,500 soldiers in the Pokrovsk direction between September 1, 2025 and December, though Lasachuk was quick to point out that these were only confirmed figures, suggesting that the real casualty total could be much higher. The other thing that Lasachuk said of Pokrovsk is that Ukraine was succeeding in turning it into a death trap for Russia's forces. In Pokrovsk, the enemy is bogged down in urban fighting, Lasachuk said before adding, "The railway line effectively divides the city into northern and southern sections. The enemy is trying to infiltrate the northern neighborhoods in small groups, but we are consistently detecting and stopping these attempts." On the more optimistic side of the casualty scale, and perhaps more in keeping with Farrar's comments, are casualty figures reported by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. In November, United 24 media reported on comments Zelensky made, in which he claimed that Ukraine had confirmed the deaths of about 25,000 Russian soldiers via drones. Most of those losses reportedly occurred in the Pokrovsk direction, with the word "most" implying at least 12,501 losses for Russia in October alone, far higher than Lasachuk's estimate for the entire period between September and the beginning of December. Regardless of who is right or whether the real numbers lie somewhere in the middle, the takeaway is that Pokrovsk has become a brutal campaign for Russia, one that is causing enormous amounts of deaths and is leading Russia to grow increasingly desperate. A sign of that desperation is seen in a January 11th article written by Forbes contributor Vikram Mittal. According to Metal, Russia has reverted to using the tanks that have previously been unsuccessful in the assaults on Pokrovsk. Albeit with a slight twist. Russia's new tactic involves pairing up two tanks with drone support. One of those tanks stands off, allowing it to deliver fire on the enemy, while the second charges forward in an attempt to make any progress on the battlefield. As for the drones, they're in place to direct fire, coordinate movement, and keep an eye out for any Ukrainian drones that might target the Russian tanks. Those tanks also switch their roles constantly in an attempt to keep Ukraine's drone operators guessing. This tactic seems to have been developed specifically to help Putin's forces overcome their Pokrovsk problem. As Mittal reports, large movements are quickly detected by reconnaissance drones and subsequently targeted. In the urban area where many of these units operate, natural bottlenecks are common, such that a single destroyed tank can block movement and bring an assault to a halt. Once immobilized, the remaining tanks become easy targets, as seen during a tank assault near Pokrovsk in early 2025. Those losses led to Russia to adopt an infiltration strategy in Pokrovsk that clearly isn't working. It's unclear how effective this new tank strategy will be against Ukrainian drones that have already proven themselves more than capable of destroying Russia's armor. After all, it's not like dispersed tank pairs suddenly become invulnerable to Ukraine's drones. Those drones already operate outside of a tank's firing range, and audio and visual signals make it clear where Russia's tanks are. And if communication between the Russian drones and their tank is cut off, say for example by Ukrainian electronic warfare systems, then all Russia is left with is armor that Ukraine has shown that it can destroy. Russia may already be trying this new tank tactic in Pokrovsk. The likelihood is that it will only lead to more casualties, along with the destruction of yet more tanks to add to the 11,550 that Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claims that Russia has lost as of January 13th. Returning to the conversation between Smart and Farrar, the latter also makes the case that winter is going to play into Ukraine's hands far more than Russia's, which may only lead to yet more death on the Pokrovsk front. The Russian forces are compelled to attack, Farrar says, after explaining how Ukraine has been using its long-range strikes to systematically whittle away at the Russian war machine that is supposed to be supporting those soldiers with equipment and resources. Back in August, the Kyiv Independent reported that these long-range strikes in 2025 alone had cost Russia about $74.1 billion, which amounted to 4.11% of the country's gross domestic product. There have been many more strikes since that article's publication, so it's not outside the realm of possibility that Ukraine hit the $100 billion mark by the end of 2025. The cost of these strikes on the battlefield is being paid in Russian soldiers' blood. Farrar continues with his winter campaign analysis, adding, "So it's the Russian forces who have to move through the snow, move through the mud, and basically turn themselves into massive blips on Ukraine's thermal cameras. Perhaps that fact, more than anything else, is what has contributed to Russia experiencing 15 losses to every one Ukrainian casualty in the Pokrovsk region." As Farrar explains, all that Ukraine's defenders have to do is sit back and wait for Russia to attack. When it does, those attacks are easily identifiable, allowing Ukraine to respond with drones, artillery, and other munitions that shatter Russia's assaults almost as soon as they begin. We see evidence of Ukraine's consistent defensive success in the Pokrovsk region due to a January 13th report on Russian assaults published by RBC Ukraine. It noted that the previous 24 hours had seen Ukraine repel 57 attempted assaults by Russia, with 26 of those assaults being destroyed in the Pokrovsk direction. Russia's casualties were heavy, as it lost 100 soldiers, 66 of whom were deemed irrecoverable, along with 45 drones, 12 vehicles, and 10 units of specialized equipment. This doesn't appear to be a one-off success for Ukraine. If Farrar is correct, it might even be a slow day at the office. The arrival of winter only makes things more difficult for Russia, as the mud and the snow slow down assaults, making it even easier for Ukraine to pick off soldiers while keeping their own safe. This entire situation is a far cry from Russia's December claims about Pokrovsk falling. Those claims were picked up on and reported by several mainstream media outlets at the time. The Independent even jumped the gun, stating on November 7th that there were fears that Pokrovsk fall would come within weeks, amidst Ukraine sending in elite units to delay what many thought was the inevitable. But the collapse of Russia's Pokrovsk offensive means that there is now a very different situation on the ground. "I don't see Pokrovsk falling in the next 2 to 3 weeks, Farrar declared in his January 12th discussion with Smart. "And maybe 2 months, Farrar added, noting that it is an astounding claim for him to be making, given the sheer number of soldiers that Putin has committed to the Pokrovsk region. It shows how diminished the Russian combat capability is, and it's pretty pathetic, Farrar says. Farrar isn't the only one making these claims about diminished capabilities. Back in September, the UK Defence Journal reported on comments made by the UK's Defence Secretary John Healey. He claimed that Russia's capabilities had diminished to the point where it would take another 4.4 years, along with another 2 million additional casualties, for Russia to take the Donbass region, of which Pokrovsk is a part. Healy also expounded on Russia's and, by extension, Putin's weakness, stating, "While President Putin likes to project strength, he is now weaker than ever. Since Putin launched his illegal invasion, he has not achieved any of his strategic aims. He has lost more than 10,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and his Black Sea fleet has been humiliated. He is forced to rely on states such as Iran for drones, North Korea for frontline troops, and China for technology and components. And perhaps that's the key point." Despite Russia's massive losses, and even though it now seems to be hitting a ratio of 15 casualties to each Ukrainian casualty in Pokrovsk, Putin has achieved the sum total of none of his strategic objectives. The Donbass alone, which Putin so desperately wants that he has made Ukraine ceding the region a condition for peace negotiations, is going to take years for Russia to fully occupy. What's happening in Pokrovsk is only going to lengthen the timeline. Remember, this is a city that was supposed to fall in the summer, but it's still standing about half a year later. Putin might claim that Russia is going to take the Donbass by force if Ukraine doesn't give it up. He conveniently omits the fact that hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of his countrymen would have to die to make that happen. The question now is, why is all of this happening in Pokrovsk? Smart asks that same question of Farrar, adding that the city is far from a behemoth, at least in terms of population. About 60,000 people lived there before Putin launched his invasion, and Smart wants to know why Russia is struggling so much to take it. Farrar has an answer. He says the former Soviet Union had mastered the traditional form of combined arms ground maneuver warfare. Armor would go in first as a sort of spearhead, followed by motor rifle troops in infantry fighting vehicles. These troops would surround a city, besiege it, and then move on to the next. Putin has been using this very playbook in Ukraine, especially during the first few years of the war that he started. Putin's problem, which has become his military's catastrophe, is that Soviet-era tactics simply don't work anymore. The great irony is that the more heavily Russia leans into this approach, the quicker it ends up being destroyed. Ukraine has to deal with, about 3 times a month, the Russians will put together a group of 5 tanks, 20 infantry fighting vehicles, and they will try to move around the north end of Pokrovsk or south end, Farrar says. And the larger the force the Russians put together, the more quickly it is detected and eliminated by the Ukrainians. This comment harkens back to what we told you earlier about Russia trying to adapt its armor strategy, as Putin has finally figured out that his Soviet-era tactics don't work. Farrar adds that Russia has tried to adapt by creating very small units, often containing 5 to 10 soldiers, who move on foot and attempt to sneak into the ruins of Pokrovsk. And this approach has found some success, up to a point. Back in October, Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty reported that Russia had managed to sneak soldiers into Pokrovsk, which it said had forced Ukraine's defenders to engage in games of whack-a-mole to get rid of them. Russia's strategy seemed to be to create small gaps in the combat lines with these infiltrators, which would then be followed by larger forces and perhaps armor, once the infiltrators had established their positions in Pokrovsk. You may already see the problem with this strategy. Sending such small units into Pokrovsk may be a good idea in the context of sneaking soldiers past Ukraine's defenses, but once those soldiers arrive, they're entering a space that Ukraine knows very well. It's like the ants arriving at a picnic, and the city is holding because a ruined city is as good as a mountaintop in terms of defensible terrain, Farrar says. The Russians are throwing themselves into a complex 3-dimensional urban battle space where the Ukrainians have already determined interlocking fields of fire. Or in simpler terms, Russia is sending soldiers on foot and without armor into traps that Ukraine is setting for them, and Putin is being forced to swallow another dose of irony as the destructive force that Russia has rained down on Pokrovsk for so long has become an asset for Ukraine's defenders. Pokrovsk has become a meat grinder unlike any yet seen in Ukraine, and the Kremlin's only real strategy seems to be to feed its soldiers into that meat grinder and then watch them die. That's an approach that gets you a 15-to-1 casualty rate. Let's revisit some of the figures that we discussed earlier in the video. We told you that various sources place the number of soldiers committed to Pokrovsk at between 150 and 170,000. Ukraine has between 1 soldier for every 10 to 15 of these Russian occupiers. If we assume that the high-end estimates are accurate, that means there are 170,000 Russian soldiers versus 11,333 Ukrainian defenders. Now let's throw the 15-to-1 casualty ratio that the Kyiv Post reports into the mix. If that ratio holds, it means that Russia will have to burn through all 170,000 of its soldiers to eradicate the 11,000 Ukrainians that are defending Pokrovsk. Again, this assumes that Farrar's figures are accurate. But if they are, that means that Russia will have burned through an army that is close to the size of the UK's active force of 184,860 all to take one city. We're already starting to see all of these issues come to fruition for Russia and Ukraine. On January 8th, the New Voice of Ukraine and UNN both reported on comments made by the Ukrainian Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief, Oleksandr Syrsky. Though Syrsky pointed out the situation on the Pokrovsk front was still very difficult, with Ukraine's defenders facing about 50 combat engagements daily, per the former outlet. According to UNN, Syrsky also said that for all the Russian efforts, the northern part of Pokrovsk is still Ukraine's. Our troops are making maximum efforts to stop the enemy's advance and destroy its personnel and equipment. The northern part of Pokrovsk is under our control. We are stopping the enemy in Mirnorad. We are conducting an active defense, Syrsky said. That alone tells you how badly things are going for Russia. Despite the dire situation in Pokrovsk, Putin's forces are failing to advance into the one part of the city that Ukraine still holds. And with each failure comes more death, adding up to the 15 casualties to every one Ukrainian that the Kyiv Post claims. We'll leave you with a small coda to this story. Back in March 2024, Espresso.tv spoke to the commander of the honor company of Ukraine's Da Vinci Wolves, Oleksandr Yabchenko. At the time, Yabchenko claimed that Russia had greater mobilization resources than Ukraine, allowing Putin to field 4 soldiers to every one Ukrainian fighter. But in making that claim, Yabchenko also said something interesting about what he believed that Ukraine would have to achieve in terms of casualty ratios to defeat Russia. If we don't inflict at least twice as many losses, at least 8-1 or even more, we have a high chance of losing this war, the commander said before adding, as I said, 1-8, better of course, 1-15, why not dream about it? Sometimes dreams really do come true. And if Yabchenko is correct, and Ukraine can maintain the casualty ratio now seen in Pokrovsk, who's to say that Ukraine can't win the war? Russia is certainly losing enough soldiers to make that possible, and its forces will have to face the terrifying fortress belt they will need to topple if they are to take the Donbass. Perhaps 15 casualties to 1 is just a prelude for much worse to come for a Russian military that is running out of ideas, equipment, and soldiers. Manpower is something that is in increasingly short supply in Russia, the point where the country is no longer able to recruit enough soldiers to replace those that it's losing. Putin's war has turned into a demographic and military crisis for Russia, and situations like that in Pokrovsk are only making these crises worse. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more updates on the Pokrovsk situation and what seems to be Putin's attempts to destroy Russia's military through his incompetence. And thank you, as always, for watching.